Hello everyone and welcome back to the German History Series. Today we're going to be looking at Bavaria and going through all of the rulers of that region in Germany from its inception as a duchy during the Merovingian Frankish kingdom all the way to the end of World War I, and going through the detail on how Bavaria changed and everything like that throughout the time and its power and influence. Now, if you haven't already, go check out parts 1 and 2. Last time we covered Prussia, so if you haven't already, please go check that one out and then come back here. We are doing this series to lead up to my trip to Germany at the end of the summer, where we're posting a bunch of historic site videos and things like that, so you definitely want to check out that series. But let's get into Bavaria. So Bavaria, as you guys probably know, is the largest state within Germany today as far as land goes, and it has a unique influence that really no other part of the country has. And we'll learn a lot about that today, but what I like to call Bavaria is usually the second place man in the grand scheme of Germany, because it seems like whatever time period in history you look at, Bavaria was always never on top in Germany. There was always somebody else ahead of them, and it's not the same person. It's kind of like when you play a video game or you play a game or something against people and you always seem to get second place, so close to winning, but you lose to different people each time. That's what Bavaria is. We're going to learn a lot about that today, and we're going to learn about how Bavaria shaped Germany, because it had a lot of influence, and we're going to learn about all about that today. So strap in, be sure to comment, like, subscribe, grab some popcorn, whatever you want to do, because we're going to go right in to Bavaria. Let's head to the Alps, boys.
Alright, that was really cringe.
Bavaria, first off, is one of the oldest nations and states within Germany today. Its roots go back well over 1,000 years, and it has one of the richest histories of any part of Germany today, any state within Germany today. Now, Bavaria, to really give you the full story of how Bavaria came to be, we need to go all the way back to the best place to start when you talk about this kind of stuff: the fall of the Western Roman Empire, 476 AD. At this time, Rome was conquered by a man named Odoacer in Italy. Now, he didn't last very long. The whole Western Roman Empire ceased to exist in the year 476. And for those of you guys that know your history, most of northwestern Europe was dominated by the Franks, specifically the Merovingian Franks, who controlled this area for about 300 years. And it was them who started Bavaria. Now, Bavaria gets its first start and created as a duchy. It was first conceived in 555 AD by the Merovingian kings. Now, keep in mind, this is only about 80 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So Bavaria is freaking old. Yeah, doesn't mean it's not mighty. It's just freaking old. It's an old place. Anyway, now, the Merovingian dynasty created it, who ruled the Franks at the time. Now, the Merovingians were previously Germanic barbarians to the Romans. However, eventually they got a lot of power and were able to take over that entire region after the Romans ceased to exist in that area in Western Rome. Now, during this time, the Franks occupied the border of what we know today as Bavaria and administered a duke there as basically a vassal to them. This Bavaria did largely remain, however, mostly self-governed. It wasn't like Bavaria is today, where it's a federal state within Germany. Bavaria served as an independent country, however, was a vassal to the Franks, so kind of a Holy Roman Empire-esque thing. So Bavaria had the right to govern itself, but it was kind of in alliance and had to serve some things for the Franks. The Franks were the superior dominant power there. They chose a man named Garibald to the position, who was at the head of the Agilolfing dynasty, very prominent at this time, who had close ties to the Merovingian kings. So, yeah. This was the beginning of a series of Agilolfing rulers, which would last for the next 2 centuries in Bavaria. So the Agilolfing family was appointed to the title of Duke of Bavaria, the very first duchy that existed in Bavaria. The first of many, let me tell you. Now, things stayed pretty steady for a while until the 8th century when Charlemagne, the new king of the Franks from the Carolingian dynasty, conquered most of Germany during his reign, including the rest of Bavaria. Now, the Merovingians never really reached all of Bavaria. They just had a border state there as a vassal to them. Now, Charlemagne took them over. Duke Tassilo III, who staunchly opposed assimilation into Charlemagne's realms, and in 788 he was accused of treason and sentenced to death. However, he eventually gave in and granted pardon, joining a monastery, and renounced his duchy for Charlemagne. So he gave it up to Charlemagne. So Charlemagne ended up conquering it, and Tassilo III was not for that anyway. Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, succeeded him as emperor. Louis decided to divide the empire up during his reign. He bestowed the titles of Bavaria amongst his sons, Louis the German, who took charge of the province as king of Bavaria. So he wasn't a duke anymore. His son, Louis the German, became the king of Bavaria under his father, Louis the Pious, as emperor. After Louis the Pious died, the Treaty of Verdun was signed in 843, granting Louis the German to the title King of East Francia, which would later evolve into the Holy Roman Empire. He created 4 duchies within this. East Francia was divided into Swabia, Franconia, Saxony, and obviously Bavaria. Bavaria was one of the 4, appointing his son Carloman as the king of Bavaria. However, Charles the Fat infamously subsumed the entire empire again. So therefore, Bavaria was reinstated by the Luitpolding Margraves of Carinthia in the early 900s. So Bavaria went back and forth between being assimilated, completely ruled by the crown of the emperor himself, and other kings that were below him in the area. So Bavaria kind of went back and forth during this time, and this was a big political move by the kings and the emperors of the Franks at the time in East Francia, because they didn't want Bavaria becoming too powerful. So they reappointed different families and different royal houses all over the place at different times, so that way one dynasty couldn't take hold in Bavaria and get very powerful. So it was kind of one of those moves. Bavaria couldn't really firmly establish itself, and they repeatedly shifted Bavaria's authority to different ruling dynasties, so none could really get anything going. So things persist through the end of the late 11th century with this Luitpolding / different Salian king. A bunch of different houses took place in Bavaria at that point. Not much really went down as far as growth for the duchy. It just kind of stayed as a thing there with the Dukes of Bavaria, mainly controlled by Carinthian and Saxon rulers throughout the time. So that's what happens. But in 1070, Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV appointed the House of Welf to the Duchy of Bavaria. The Welfs also ruled in Saxony, a good note to make there. But the Welfs were very powerful. I mean, they're going to get even more powerful, and they're going to actually be the first family, besides the Agilolfings, the first of the Holy Roman Empire to really firmly establish itself. Now, the Holy Roman Empire had a bunch of different states underneath of it that were subordinate to the emperor himself, but they were mostly self-governed. So Bavaria mainly stayed self-governed, but it was not by any means even close to being the most powerful in there. It was just still a small little duchy this time. The last Welf ruler was Henry the Lion. He was also known as Henry the XII. He was a very popular candidate for being elected emperor on several occasions. Now, the thing about him was the Welfs had allegiance to the Pope. The Pope rather had allegiance to them. The Pope supported the Welfs for candidacy for the title of emperor. However, the Hohenstaufens, under a guy named Frederick Barbarossa, ended up getting that title. He was very against the Welfs, and a civil war kind of broke out between them that was very famous. They had a heated rivalry, and the emperor had Henry deposed of all his family's titles in order to eliminate his threat to the title of emperor, giving Bavaria up for the House of Wittelsbach. So the House of Welf was completely stripped altogether. Don't feel too bad for them though, because eventually his son became Holy Roman Emperor in 1208. So he was the only Welf person, the only member of the Welf dynasty to achieve that title. Anyway, the Wittelsbachs ended up coming in. Now, the Wittelsbachs were a very relatively small house at this point, but they ended up coming in and taking over Bavaria. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, Bavaria was partitioned several times into even smaller states. So the main people in charge of the Holy Roman Empire, the ruling houses, were not very fond of allowing Bavaria to grow very much. But the first partition happened in 1253, separating Lower and Upper Bavaria, seen on the map here. Upper Bavarian dukes also served as Counts Palatinate of the Rhine for a few generations, which that was probably their most prestigious title, as the Palatinate was an electorate at this point, had a lot more authority than Bavaria did. Bavaria was very small. The second, more drastic partition came in 1349 after the death of Louis IV, who was the only Wittelsbach emperor during this time period. There were later Wittelsbach emperors, but he was the one in the 14th century. The region was divided even further. Lower Bavaria became Bavaria Landshut and Bavaria Straubing. And then following the death of Stephen II in 1392, he made micro-duchies within Bavaria Landshut, including Bavaria Munich, which Munich is the capital of Bavaria and has been for a very long time, basically all of its history. Munich became its own little part of Bavaria as an independent part. A smaller version of Landshut and Bavaria Ingolstadt. Later on, Dachau and Leuchtenberg became independent autonomous states as well. Now, Dachau is an interesting situation because Dachau is actually where the first concentration camp was put in during World War II. Now, it's interesting to note that Dachau was at one time an independent state, and that is within Bavaria today. So, fun little fact there. Now, this partition took place for a while until eventually in the early 1500s. In 1503 to 1505, the Landshut War happened. There was a war between Landshut and Munich. And the Munich line of the Wittelsbachs ended up winning that conflict. And it is through them where we get the house of Wittelsbach that ruled in Bavaria. And we get the later electorates. The later electors of Bavaria through that branch of the Munich Wittelsbachs. Now, later on in 1623, for their participation in the 30 Years' War, Bavaria was granted to be an electorate under the Holy Roman Empire. And that is when Bavaria starts to become very powerful after this period in the 1500s, and it's just going to grow and grow and grow. So, we're going to move on to the next part of the video. Alright, so now we're going to move on to the next segment of this video. This is by a channel named Ollie Bai. Now, obviously this isn't my own original content here, but I'm just going to show you guys this. This is a map of the history of Bavaria every year, because I just want to try to give you guys as much information as possible, and I'm not really much of a graphic designer myself. I can't do much digital art and mapping things, and I'm a visual learner myself, so I benefit a lot from seeing I learned a lot from history by seeing maps and timelines, things like that. So this really helps me out understand the grasp of Bavaria as a kingdom, especially going through the medieval period. So we're going to look at this today for a few minutes, and I'm going to kind of explain what's happening. There's no commentary or anything. So this is the history of Bavaria every year, so we're just going to get into this. It's only 4 minutes long. We're not going to show the whole thing. So this is going to be a map version of Bavaria. So we start with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE. So it's using CE, Common Era, same as AD. So we can see Bavaria is not yet a thing. So this is all of the Germanic kingdoms that form after the fall of the Roman Empire. So for those of you guys that know what's up at this time period, 476, Odoacer takes over Rome and establishes the first kingdom of Italy. By Odoacer. We also have the Alemanni, the Rugi, the Sciri, the Ostrogothic kingdoms down here, Nepos, the Lombards up in the north, the Thuringi, and the Franks and the Alemanni. Now, it's interesting because Alemanni is the Spanish and French word for Germany today, which a lot of this stuff, all these names go back. Anyway, Franks is what eventually formed the Bavarian duchy. So we're going to see this here in a minute. So 476. So now we're jumping ahead to 490. So the Rugi, Sciri, the Marcomanni, and the Romans, what they call that, occupy most of this Bavarian region here. The Lombards are very small. The Czechs come in, who later become Bohemia.
So stuff's changing. By the time we get to 500, this is only about 30 years later, the Ostrogoths are dominating in the south. Odoacer is killed in 493. So that's what happens there. So he's gone. So 550, so area of Bavaria is settled. Now, the Franks come in, the Merovingians, they come in and just settle the borders of what we know now as Bavaria. It's not all of Bavaria. That doesn't happen until Charlemagne, but 555 is when Garibald's put in possession by the Merovingian kings. They placed Garibald from the Angulofing dynasty. Now, Angulofings were closely tied to the Merovingian monarchs themselves, so that's kind of how he gained credibility to be put as the first Duke of Bavaria. Now, he just served as kind of a governor for Bavaria. He wasn't really controlled too much by the Frankish kings. He was kind of a vassal to them. He mostly ruled as Bavaria as an independent state at this point. Now, he's surrounded by some big powers. You got the Lombards. The Lombards are going to keep growing. The Eastern Roman Empire, which later becomes the Byzantines, are in the south, but they're going to lose a lot more territory in the next few centuries by the time that's done and over with. And the Czechs are going to, like I say, become Bohemia, and the Merovingian Frankish Empire is really the biggest thing in Western Europe at this time, in the 500s. So that's 560. Moving on to 600, we have Tassilo. Not much else changing here. 700 CE, we have the Great Moravia here, the Avar kingdoms, Carantania. So Czechia is, the Czechs have basically dissolved. The Franks are still here, the Lombards are still here, the Croats. Now, Charlemagne's going to come in and conquer the Lombards and Bavaria as well. So Charlemagne's here in 800, so he conquers the Lombards. The Lombards are subsumed into and assimilated into the Frankish Empire. So the Franks are going to take over also Bavaria. Charlemagne deposes Tassilo III, who was the last Duke of Bavaria. He takes him out, and Charlemagne directly controls Bavaria now. As Bavaria, you'll see this throughout history. Bavaria has a large staunch of nationalism within its country, and this goes all the way back to the first millennium. A lot of nationalism in Bavaria, and that's what leads to even World War II happening. And even today, it still exists in Bavaria. So, big independence movement around the time Charlemagne does his conquests in the late 8th century. But Charlemagne eventually threatens the last duke, and Charlemagne takes it back over, and it becomes completely ruled by the Franks at this point. So, by the time we get to 900, Great Moravia is here, kind of just... I don't know a whole lot about them, but I know they were a big power, but not too long in the grand scheme of things. So Nordgau is an estate within Union of Bavaria. By the time we get to 900, Bavaria has fully become part of East Francia, ruled by, at this point, probably Henry the Foul. No, this was the time where we had a bunch of different Bavarian, you had Carloman, and it jumped back and forth between being ruled completely by East Francia and then by the actual kings in Bavaria. So, interesting there. The Kingdom of Italy's here. That is Middle Francia. So we have Middle Francia, Western Francia, which becomes France. Middle Francia starts to fizzle out probably around this time. Hungary is now a thing. Here's Bohemia up here. Nordgau, Carinthia. So Carinthia is going to have some big ties with Bavaria because it's going to be the Luitpolding dynasty. Right here, Arnulf, they come from Carinthia. So Carinthia and Bavaria are in personal union at this time. So now it's the Kingdom of Germany. At this point, East Francia is done away with. Now, obviously, that's a later thing we put on them. Bavaria becomes very powerful around this time in the 950s. So we got the Ottonian kings of Bavaria. So they're going to expand their territory into Hungary, down into Croatia. Now, by the time we get to 962, the Holy Roman Empire is founded, with Otto I being crowned. He was an Ottonian. So here's the little province of Austria right here. So that's going to later become a dominant power about 900 years from now. So like I said, Bavaria was one of the duchies along with Swabia, and there was also others like Franconia and Saxony. But Swabia is an estate tied with Bavaria because of the unions with monarchs and things like that. So Carinthia was also tied. So, yeah, Carinthia is right here. Carinthia is actually more powerful than Bavaria at this point, because the Corinthian monarchs ended up controlling Bavaria. Now, episcopal counties are established within Bavaria now. The first one is Passau, and you'll see more coming up. This is Henry IV. Now, he actually is an Ottonian at this point, so it's going to jump around many different royal houses. Like I said, no one family could control Bavaria throughout this time because the Holy Roman Emperor himself, he appointed many different families throughout the next few centuries to rule in Bavaria. So we're at the early 11th century right now, 1000s. So you saw Poland come in for a little bit, take out the Holy Roman Empire. Is going to have some more territory there. So we got some more episcopal counties. Probably the greatest name for a county in the history of mankind right here, Trent. For those of you guys who don't know, that's my name. We got Trent and Brixen put in here, as you can see, down in the south of Bavaria. So Bavaria is still very small. Austria is starting to get a little bit bigger. Austria is a unified state right now. Bavaria, not totally unified, but now we got the Salians. The Salians coming in. The Salians is where we get the term Salic law. So pretty influential there. So now in the 1100s, we get the first Welfs to the throne. Now, the Welfs are the first family to really take part in Bavaria and really have a strong grip on it. Now, the Welfs are going to become extremely, extremely powerful as we move forward here. And it's going to get so to the point where the Welfs are going to have a really powerful kingdom in the Holy Roman Empire, and Bavaria is going to become probably the number 2 strongest kingdom. And they're going to be in conflict with the Hohenstaufen emperors. Now, the thing that the Welfs have going for them is the Welfs are strongly tied to the Pope, which gives them a lot of credibility. The Pope is... Bavaria, throughout its history, has always been Catholic. And the Pope has a lot of ties with the Welfs. And so the Pope tries to get the Welf dukes in Bavaria to be elected as Holy Roman Emperor, but those don't ever happen. And then Frederick Barbarossa puts an end to it. So we got Henry X. So we're going to get to the point in the late 1100s. So here's Saxony up here. Saxony is in Union. So a lot of the Babenberg and Welf rulers of Bavaria also rule Saxony at this point. So in addition to ruling Bavaria, they also rule Saxony, which Bavaria and Saxony are the 2 most influential, and they're also like the oldest, some of the oldest provinces within the Holy Roman Empire. So Henry XII comes in. Henry XII is known as Henry the Lion. Now, he was a really strong candidate for Holy Roman Emperor in the 1150s, right before they elected Frederick Barbarossa. Like I said, he had really close ties with the Pope at this point. The Pope wanted to get a Welf onto the throne, but it didn't actually happen. And then Frederick Barbarossa puts an end to the Welfs in Bavaria because they try to lead a revolt and take out the Hohenstaufens, which is Frederick Barbarossa's house. Frederick Barbarossa was the guy who was involved in the Third Crusade. Very influential Holy Roman Emperor, especially in this point in history. So 1180 is when Frederick Barbarossa strips Henry XII of all of his titles. And so he loses his possessions, and Bavaria goes from being a stem duchy back to basically starting over the bottom of the barrel here, back to a feudal duchy. So this point, it's going to become weak, and it's going to take them a while to get back to where they originally were. So this is Louis I. So now the Wittelsbachs, which is a relatively small house in the grand scheme of things at this point, is granted the throne. Now the Wittelsbachs are going to be able to get one Emperor Louis IV onto the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. Now this is another interesting thing. We have electoral palatinate, which is an estate in personal union with Bavaria. Now the palatinate is a very important part of the Holy Roman Empire because it is an electorate, which means that the palatinate rulers have the authority to elect the Holy Roman Emperor. Bavaria never did, which is part of the reason the Welfs never were able to actually achieve that title, because in the grand scheme of things, if you look at the pyramid of authority in the Holy Roman Empire, the Welfs didn't have as much control as some of the other places did, but the Welfs were definitely on the path to, and that's what the Hohenstaufens were scared of at that time. especially with the papal alliance that they had. So the Palatinate's up here, so they're going to be in union for a little bit. The Palatinate's very strong. They are an electorate. So now at this point, one of the dukes decides to split up his realms in Bavaria, creating Lower and Upper Bavaria. Now, Upper Bavaria is the province that gets the electoral Palatinate. Now, Lower Bavaria is just there. So we get Henry the 13th in Lower Bavaria and Louis II, the Strict, in Upper Bavaria. Now, keep in mind, this is still both the House of Wittelsbach. The House of Wittelsbach has many different branches, and you're going to see those come in, but one of them is going to come out on top in the next couple hundred years. So they're going to slowly grow. Now, this is very tough for them to grow with being the separation, but it is what it is at this point. So Hungary's coming in. So the Holy Roman Empire is grown. So for a brief time, they control Brandenburg up in the 1300s. So they lose control of the Rhineland Palatinate. Bavaria gets reunited once Louis IV is elected Holy Roman Emperor in the 1300s. I believe 1329 to 1347 he rules the Holy Roman Empire. So that is the first time you see a Wittelsbach actually controlling the entire empire. Now that's going to only happen, well, he doesn't control the whole entire empire because that's just now not how it was governed, but he becomes that ceremonial leader. So the Wittelsbach, and it's going to happen again later on in the 1700s, but Louis IV. But once Louis IV dies, a lot goes on in Bavaria. As you can see here, it's split even further into Tyrol as an estate, but Lower Bavaria is divided into Landshut and Straubing at this point. So you can see this here. So this is kind of what I want to show you. Landshut ends up taking over Upper Bavaria, which is interesting at this point in the 1300s. So we see this, and then Landshut gets divided in the 1390s even further. So we see here different monarchs. So Henry the 16th rules a smaller portion of Landshut. So Landshut itself gets shrunk. And then you have Stephen II ruling Ingolstadt, and then which is Bavaria, Ingolstadt, and then you get Straubing ruled by Albert I, and then Henry the 16th rules a smaller portion of Landshut, and then Ernst William III rules Munich, Bavaria. So you have Munich, Ingolstadt, Landshut, and Straubing as 4 different parts of Bavaria, and there's going to be even smaller ones that come out later on, but I don't really think they show it on this map. So by the time we get to 1400, it's a complete mess in Bavaria. Now, Straubing gets a few estates up here in the Netherlands, in Holland, and in Luxembourg, but those are never held on for too long. We'll get back into this here. So the Straubing is taken out around the middle of the 1400s, and then later on, so is Ingolstadt. So it becomes the conflict, just 2 parts again, between Landshut and Munich. And so these guys are going to eventually, in about 50 years from now, fight in the Landshut War, which happens in the early 1500s, 1503. So the Landshut War takes place. Now, Albert IV, the Wise, who he is the Duke of Munich, Bavaria. Now, keep in mind, Munich is the capital of Bavaria, so that's kind of how that happens. So Munich obviously is going to have the stronger possessions. So the Munich branch, that Munich line of the House of Wittelsbach, is going to now take control of Bavaria entirely. So this is going to happen all the way until we get to the 1600s, when it becomes an electorate. So Bavaria stays into the hands of this branch for a while, until we get to 1623, because as you can see, Ottomans down here at Venice has its own state. So 1623 is when it's made an electorate. So obviously Maximilian I, after the 30 Years' War enduring, Bavaria aligns with the Holy Roman Emperors, which at that point were in Austria, are very strongly Catholic. They align with the Catholic faith during the 30 Years' War, and so the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, he was a Habsburg, declares Bavaria to be an electorate, which just strengthens its power further. However, Bavaria doesn't change a whole lot of the way it's governed by itself. Its self-sovereignty is not changed too much. at this point. But I'm just going to end it there, and we're going to continue with the video on the wall tree because a lot changes within the next few centuries in Bavaria. But that's kind of how the medieval period went down within Bavaria and kind of how we get the state itself.
Okay, so we resume in the year 1623. Now, just a little bit of a recap here. Bavaria existed as a duchy from 555 to 1623 in various parts ruled by various houses and things like that. The last ruling house at this point was the House of Wittelsbach. This is the logo of the House of Wittelsbach. And it's an interesting situation happening in Bavaria in 1623 because the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, who was part of the House of Habsburg, grants Maximilian, the current Duke of Bavaria, as the first ever Prince Elector of Bavaria. Now, this formally adopts Bavaria as an electorate within the Holy Roman Empire. So now Bavaria actually has the authority to elect the Holy Roman Emperor and becomes a very powerful state within the German country of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the reason he was given that title is because Maximilian I did a really good job during the 30 Years' War fighting for the Catholics. Now, 30 Years' War is usually considered to be one of the first world wars and probably the deadliest war Europe had ever seen up to that point. It was a big war, many driving factors, but one of the biggest ones was Protestants versus Catholics. Now, the Habsburgs, who ruled the Holy Roman Empire at that time, were mostly Catholic. And so was Bavaria. So you see, Bavaria throughout history has always been a Catholic state. Now, at this point in the early 1600s, Protestantism is sweeping across the north. In most places, if you take a map of Germany, even really to this day still in most of history, the northern part dominated by Prussia and things like that, which we went into the last video, is mostly Protestant, and the south were mostly Catholic. Now, the Habsburg emperors were from Austria, which is in the south, and Austria was always Catholic nation. And Bavaria sided with Austria, and for most of history, you're going to see Bavaria and Austria as kind of like cousins to each other. Bavaria was always more tied with Austria than it was to Prussia, for example, whenever that comes into play. So the Bavarian dukes helped a lot with assisting the Holy Roman Emperor during the 30 Years' War for fighting for Catholicism. That is why they were granted this title during the 30 Years' War. Now, Maximilian had previously been Duke since 1597, but his title was upgraded, and he was there all the way as the Prince Elector until 1651. We go down a couple generations. We have his son, Ferdinand Maria, and Maximilian II, Emmanuel. Now, Maximilian II, Emmanuel is interesting because his son, Charles VII, ended up becoming Holy Roman Emperor in 1742. Now, the reason he got this, he was the only non-Habsburg to receive this title since the 1400s, basically. The first Wittelsbach in generations, centuries. But he got it because he ended up actually marrying Maria Amelia von Österreich. Right? I don't know how to pronounce that too well, but that. Her. She was the daughter of Holy Roman Emperor Joseph I. So that gained Charles VII some credibility. Now, he was already the Duke, the Elector of Bavaria, and so the nobles and the electors at the time elected him to be Holy Roman Emperor. Unfortunately, he only served for 3 years before he died in 1745, and then the titles went back to the Habsburgs. But this is one of the few times where the Habsburgs did not control the emperorship at that point. Now, his son was Maximilian III Joseph. Now, Maximilian III Joseph ended up dying in 1777 with no sons. And there were no close sons in the line. Now, Bavaria is important to note. This goes for any German country. Bavaria followed a system known as agnatic primogeniture, or Salic law. Now, Salic law states that only males can inherit the throne. So no women are allowed to inherit the throne in any German country, ever. And not only does it have to be male, but that male has to come from a strict male-only line. And this entire branch of the Wittelsbachs had died out in 1777, which led to a conflict called the War of the Bavarian Succession. Small conflict that wasn't too major in the grand scheme of things, but victorious ended up being the next in line to the throne, who happened to be Maximilian III Joseph's 12th cousin, once removed, Charles Theodore. Yes, he was still a Wittelsbach from a completely different branch. 12th cousin once removed. They had a common ancestor from way back in like the freaking, I don't even know, 1200, something like that. Craziness. But yes, they are still related. A 12th cousin once removed. The throne jumped, the title of Prince Elector jumped right from him all the way over here. Now, Charles Theodore actually ended up also dying in 1799 without any children, or at least sons. And so this actually fell off. Sorry, these are like this. The reason these are black and white is because the place that I printed these pictures out didn't feel like printing all the pictures. And this was a mess. And guys, it was just a complete mess. But just as that happened, he dies in 1799, Charles Theodore. He was the last person to just be exclusively the Prince Elector of Bavaria. His father, Johann Christian's brother, Joseph Karl, it had to go to the next line. So Theodore Eustock had these sons here. Joseph Karl had to jump to this branch here of the family, who had a daughter named Maria Franziska von Pfalz-Sulzbach. Now, she was in the Palatinate region, and she married a guy named Pfalzgraf Friedrich Michael von Zweibrücken-Birkenfeld. And so it was the Zweibrücken-Birkenfeld line that ends up taking the throne. Now, they're all still Wittelsbachs, but that's if you trace the male line back, it's Zweibrücken-Birkenfeld. But he had the credibility through his wife, who was the descendant of Charles Theodore's grandfather. Anyhow, complicated stuff. That's how succession works. And when you have succession rules so strict, that's what happens. So anyway, in 1799, the elector became Maximilian IV Joseph. Now, he's known as Maximilian I Joseph as well as both, because depending on what title you're talking about. Now, it was during his reign that Bavaria was moved from being an electorate and upgraded into a kingdom. Now, this happened mainly for one sole reason. Napoleon Bonaparte. Ever heard of him? Probably. He came in the early 1800s and conquered most of Europe, including most of Germany as well. The only part of Germany he didn't really unify was Prussia, but all of the south and western parts of Germany was under control of his autonomous state that he called the Confederation of the Rhine. Now, that was first put in place in 1806. During this time, Maximilian IV Joseph crowned himself King of Bavaria, and Bavaria became a kingdom, along with other kingdoms such as the Grand Duchy of Baden, Württemberg as a kingdom, Saxony, and Hanover, places like that. There was also down in there was other places. The Grand Duchy of Baden, Grand Duchy of Hesse-Darmstadt, and places like that, the Kingdom of Württemberg, down in the south. So during the Confederation of the Rhine, that happened. Now, Napoleon was eventually kicked out after the Battle of Leipzig around 1813. So Bavaria actually ended up staying around, and the Congress of Vienna took place in 1814, 1815, and granted Bavaria to be part of the German Confederation, which was created, and the Austrian Emperor at the time, Franz II, was appointed to be its president, which the Bavarians were very happy about because they were on-sided with the Austrians because they'd always been in alliance with the Habsburgs due to their Catholic similarities and stuff like that. So he ends up ruling as king all the way until his death in 1825, and he's succeeded by King Ludwig I. Now, Ludwig I ends up abdicating the throne early in 1848. Abdicate just means you give up the throne. He abdicated in 1848. At this point in time, a lot of revolutions took place across Europe. And there was a lot of movements to depose many monarchs throughout Europe. And he didn't really like this pressure, and he was very unpopular within Bavaria, things like that. There was also a weird, scandalous money corruption thing where he gave like 20 million francs to Greece for some cause, some reason, without consent from anybody. So that was kind of fishy. And so for those reasons, he gave up the throne. He actually lived another 20 years after this period. So he had his eldest son, Maximilian II, succeed him. Now, Maximilian II ruled until 1864. He actually died at a relatively young age, leaving his son, Ludwig II, who was just 18 years old at the time, as the new king of Bavaria. Now, Ludwig II was probably had the most impact on the kingdom of any ruler that had there. Now, Ludwig II was very prone and very keen to the arts. A lot of the places we associate with Bavaria today, some of the biggest attractions in the country today, such as Neuschwanstein Castle, he built during his reign there, and he was very influential in building a lot of projects, things like that. He stayed very true to the faith of his country. Now, he was king during what is known as the Franco-Prussian War. At this time, Prussia had fully dominated the country of Germany. Now, Bavaria wanted nothing to do with Prussia because Prussia was Protestant and Bavaria was Catholic. Now, Bavaria started to get a little scared when Prussia was starting to dominate the scene above Austria. Now, Austria had always been the most powerful. However, toward the middle of the 1800s, Prussia really starts to dominate. Now, Chancellor at the time, a very pristine politician, Otto von Bismarck, was able to go to war against the Austrians to curb their power and kick them out of the German Confederation, and went to war up in places like Schleswig-Holstein, took some land from Denmark, places like that, conquered all of the other kingdoms and annexed them up in the north, places such as Hanover, things like that were all conquered. Bavaria did not want to be, and so after Prussia kicked Austria out of the German Confederation, they formed the North German Confederation, which included almost all of Germany, and Bismarck wanted all of Germany in that. However, Bavaria, along with other places in the south, such as Kingdom of Württemberg, Grand Duchy of Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt, they did not want to be part of that pan-German alliance that was being created by Bismarck. So Bismarck had to find a way to get Bavaria into Prussia, so that way it could become a unified state, which Bavaria had not wanted at all. Now, going off a little bit here, something interesting happened in 1868, because over in Spain, the queen at the time, Isabella II, was deposed by her people in what is known as the Glorious Revolution in Spain, the Spanish Glorious Revolution. Now, what was interesting is the Spanish people nominated Leopold, the Prince of Hohenzollern. Now, Hohenzollern was the ruling house in Prussia at this time. Now, Otto von Bismarck wanted him, the Prussian prince, who was a relative to the King of Prussia, Wilhelm I at the time. He was a relative to him. And Otto von Bismarck wanted him to be the Spanish king. He wanted him to take the title after the candidacy of him that they nominated. But Leopold did not want that title at all. And Otto von Bismarck tried pressuring him into it, but he wouldn't do it. And so eventually, what happened was, well, here's just my take on it. I don't think the Spanish should have not. Eventually, it went to an Italian guy instead. But I don't think they should have nominated either a French or Prussian person to that title, just simply because of the power that was going to be power struggle at that time. But Napoleon III, who was Emperor of France at this point, was very scared about Leopold's candidacy, because he knew that if a Prussian prince was going to be put on the throne of Spain, that he would be surrounded by enemies, because he was already enemies with Prussia at that point. So Napoleon sent an ambassador to Ems, a place called Ems in Prussia, to meet with, this was in Western Germany, to meet with the King of Prussia at the time, Wilhelm I. Now, Wilhelm I basically said, you know, my cousin or whatever is not interested in the throne. And then the French guy said, well, we can end this conversation here if you just decide, you say that he's not going to take the throne because we do not support it, and that you will renounce the throne to any other future Prussian prince or royalty or anything like that. So Wilhelm I said, we said, okay, Leopold's not going to become the king, but we're not going to, it's just too big of a move to make it to say that no Prussian will ever get the throne. So we're just going to say that. We're just going to politely say that, and then they went on with their day. But Otto von Bismarck decided to alter that and posted a telegram in France and basically made it seem like Wilhelm I was slapping the French in the face, which that ticked off Napoleon III. So then they decided to go to war. And the reason Otto von Bismarck did that was because the Bavarians, going back to them, had previously stated that they would fight with the Prussians if a war with France ever happened, because Prussia and Bavaria didn't really like each other a whole lot. Bavaria was always the number 2 to Prussia. They didn't like each other a whole lot, but they both had a common enemy in France. So Otto von Bismarck knew that, and he knew whichever way he could wage war with France would be golden to getting Bavaria to join the Confederation. So, very strong political move. Bismarck knew what he was doing. And so he wanted to make it so that the French would be on the offensive and not the Prussians. So the French got ticked off at this thing known as the Ems Dispatch, which led to what we now call the Franco-Prussian War. The Franco-Prussian War was absolutely huge. Almost 2 million people participated in this war. This was a massive conflict that took place. And the Bavarians were helping Prussia, so were the places in the south of Germany, because they wanted to defend their lands, because a lot of the war took place in the Rhineland area, which is right on the doorstep of Bavaria and other places like Württemberg and things like that, and Baden, places like that. So, Franco-Prussian War happens. The Prussians actually are able to take over Paris, and the French are completely just about blown out in that conflict. It only lasts a few months, and in 1871, Wilhelm I of Prussia is crowned in Versailles. He is the Kaiser of Germany at this point, creating the German Empire. And Napoleon III of France had to give up his realms, and France became a republic again after this. So Germany was now the leading power in Europe. And so Bavaria really had not much of a choice to join the North German Confederation. So Bavaria was then put part in that. Anyway, sorry about all that. We're going back into the monarchy now. Ludwig II ruled until 1886, when he mysteriously died. Basically, the way the story goes, in June of 1886, he was basically going for a walk with his psychiatrist at the time. And both of them were found dead around a lake just outside of Munich, and no one really knows how they died. His death was ruled as suicide, but some think he may have, his doctor may have killed him, or he killed the doctor and then killed himself, or the doctor drowned him, but that seems unlikely that some of those happened. It's a lot of conspiracies, but supposedly he was found dead in a lake in 1886, so no one really knows what happened there. That was kind of an interesting story. So that's Ludwig III. The throne then jumped to his brother, King Otto. Now, Otto was not very fit to rule at all. He was big into the arts, just like his brother had been. But he was not very politically inclined, got outsmarted many times, and wasn't very good for Bavaria. And he ended up abdicating the throne in 1913. Now, neither of these two men had any children, at least sons, to inherit the throne. So the throne had to jump to Maximilian II's nephew, their first cousin, Ludwig III. Now, Prince Regent Luitpold was the father of Ludwig III. Now, Ludwig III becomes king in 1913, and he is the last king of Bavaria. And he ends up ruling until the end of World War I, when all German monarchies are abolished. Now, he actually ended up dying in 1921, so he only had a retirement of about 3 years before he ended up dying at the age of 76. So, he was the last Wittelsbach monarch to rule. Now, interestingly, I mentioned Bavaria had always had this kind of unique ideology that really no other place in Germany had. They had a lot of staunch nationalism that happened in their country. And after World War I, a lot of the stuff that takes place revolutionary in Bavaria. Now, World War II, I'm trying to think where I want to start with this. There was a theory, like I said, that Austria was very closely tied to Bavaria, and both Austria and Germany both suffered largely from World War I. And there was a philosophy called Anschluss, which was incorporating Austria into Germany. Now, the National Workers' Party, which was led eventually by a guy named Adolf Hitler, who was from Bavaria. Oh, he was actually from Austria. But he ended up getting his start in Munich, and all that stuff happened there. That was all in Bavaria. And Bavaria had all this nationalism, and that was where that's where Hitler was going to get his start, because he played like that. He knew what the people of Bavaria wanted. And so, Germany and Austria and all these places had to pay war debts and everything like that. And so they were in huge debt and depression and everything like that, economic failure and everything like that, and they were in decline immensely. So Hitler had this idea of Anschluss, which was incorporating Austria into Germany. Now, he already knew about Anschluss because he was from Austria, and during World War I, he moved to Germany to fight for the Germans in World War I, but he was originally from Austria. And so in 1938, once Hitler had fully taken over the government, Anschluss was a complete success, and he was able to march to Vienna with absolutely no fighting, because almost all of the big four political factions in Austria all supported the idea of German annexation, because that's just how it went. And so Bavaria and Austria are always closely tied to each other. That's just kind of how it is. And Bavarian nationalism still to this day takes place, because Bavaria is the only federal state in Germany known as the Free State of Bavaria. That title means nothing, but it goes to show that they really do think of themselves differently. And Bavaria had always been really its own independent thing that was always tied into something else. So it's very interesting there. That's the story of Bavaria. Sorry I went on a bunch of tangents, but that's just kind of what happens. There's a lot here. And I'm very excited for the trip to Germany. And the next episode, we're going to be talking about Saxony. And that's going to be coming out soon. So let me know what you guys think about this. This is the entire history of Bavaria. And we'll see you guys next time. Be sure to comment, like, subscribe. Goodbye. Wah!